Did anyone else make it?
Scanning. Just dust and echoes.
I know the rage that drives you. That impossible anger strangling the grief until the memory of your loved one is just poison in your veins. One day you catch yourself wishing the person you loved had never existed. So you'll be spared your pain. I wasn't always here in the mountains. My great love. She was taken from me. Like you, I was forced to learn there are those without decency. Must be fought without hesitation, without pity. Your anger gives you great power. But if you let it, it will destroy you. As it almost did me.
What stopped it?
Vengeance.
I need a weapon.
Could you watch me die?
G'day guys. Welcome to my continued campaign to raise awareness about the total lack of care towards the Halo franchise from its current custodians. Today's target, Season 1 of the Halo show. Before Season 2 drops, I thought it would be fun to go back and take a look at the dumpster fire that was. But rather than raging about it, like I did when I first reviewed it, I thought I'd compare it to some of the previous live-action adaptations of Halo, and demonstrate how, despite being in its own timeline, it completely missed the mark in terms of being Halo. And that Paramount, at best, phoned it in, and at worst, actively produced a garbage show. And not just a garbage Halo show, like a garbage show, full stop. Before I go any further, I'm not demonising Paramount for wanting to tell their own story with the Silver timeline. Although that choice seems to be a growing trend with modern Hollywood. It's almost like no one in the industry wants to do any research anymore. However, I do want to outline why I think this was a poor choice, and how it was ultimately detrimental to their efforts to produce a quality Halo adaptation. That being said, CBS Paramount / Showtime took an established IP with a pre-existing fan base and placed an over-reliance on superficiality and recognisable Halo tropes without developing their world, characters and factions any deeper than the glossy surface, if you can even go that far. This is also at odds with their alleged goal to create an alternate timeline for new fans, as the little world building that was conducted in Season 1 would have left the casual viewer perplexed about the key factions, the current state of the galaxy at war, and the ultimate morality of the UNSC. This will be a bit of a deep dive, and on the way down we'll compare Paramount's show to the previous live-action adaptations of Halo to demonstrate the difference between a lack of creative effort and lazy world building versus actual care for the canon and effective world building that, while not necessarily liked by all fans at the time, still amounted to growth of the Halo story, rather than a soulless cash grab. A disclaimer, I am very passionate about Halo. I would assess that Halo is actually my favourite sci-fi franchise, even ahead of Star Wars.
It's treason, then.
And if not my favourite, perhaps the one that I feel has had the most influence on my life. Between the friendships I made playing Halo to the wealth of canon I could get lost in, Halo has always been an escape for me. It's the place I like to go to enjoy myself. So when the series dropped, I wasn't just disappointed, I was hurt. My safe space had been violated, debauched and spat out like countless other IPs. And while I knew it was a possibility, I never expected it to happen to Halo. In fact, were it not for Paramount, I would have never have turned to YouTube seeking resolution, where, as it turned out, my pain could be used to make others laugh. Which is fortunate because I was sickened by the lack of care and quality that had gone into the show. But as it turns out, screaming about the series online and attempting to have a discourse on social media in the modern era was about as easy as a Halo 2 Lazo run.
Don't be afraid. I've a banana for you.
Thus, my channel was born. Thanks, Paramount. As always, I will attempt to remain objective, but I cannot promise to remain dispassionate.
Don't make a girl a promise.
if you know you can't keep it.
My intent by the end of this video is to convince you that not only is CBS, Paramount / Showtime's adaptation and their Silver Timeline a lazy cash grab leeching off an established fan base, but also highlight that 343i should be held accountable for it.
So check your mouths, find your chairs, and get set for a combat drop.
Immediate. Grid Kilo 23 is hot. Recommend mission abort. Roger, Recon.
It's your call, Sarge.
We're going in. Get tactical, Marines!
Master Chief, get aboard that carrier. Secure the Prophet of Regret. This is the only place on Earth the Covenant decided to land. That Prophet is going to tell us why.
That's right, CBS copyright snipers. I'm still on this hill. Come and get me.
Made what was going to be a quick and decisive win into 5 years of hell. Of course, that's all Harvest is today. It's hell down there. But now it's ours again.
There will be a great deal of hardship on the road ahead.
It would be unfair to compare the Silver Timeline directly to 20 years of Halo lore, right?
Correct.
Not just wrong, you're stupid.
Incorrect. The Silver Timeline blatantly and unapologetically used the iconography of Halo to sell their series, choosing tropes over research. And as a result, their lack of world building, character development, and internal consistency is totally on them for the choices they made. Calling this show Halo is an insult to every fan that cared enough to take a chance on this soulless cash grab. They used Chief's armor, the name, sound effects, and more from the games in a vain lure to peddle their shallow streaming service, without any understanding or appreciation of what it meant or how it worked. All while absolving themselves of any responsibility to adhering to the established and much loved canon. This might have been forgivable if the show was able to stand on its own, telling a decent story that could unite new and old fans without depending on the hook that is Halo. But as I said, that is not the case. In fact, it seemed that the best defense that could be rallied against the longtime fans when the show aired was to state that the show named Halo wasn't made for them.
Say what?
So no, I don't think it would be unfair to draw direct comparisons, given how smug and superior Paramount and Showtime's chosen champions were as they promoted the series prior to its release.
The medium it was established in was a first-person shooter video game, where the character was kept very opaque, and you don't have a ton of character development or backstory, or you don't have a sense of what he's thinking, because you're meant to fill in all the details with your own personality. This is for a television show, and I think the most important thing to connect with a TV audience is that the performance feels authentic and true and lived in.
This heretic and those who follow him must be silenced.
All this while accusing the fandom, who had cultivated the franchise for over 2 decades, of gatekeeping. This absolute lack of respect for Halo cannot stand. I'll do my best not to destroy the show in place. However, when you're creating a show based off the Halo IP without using the established timeline as a tentpole for your story's canvas, you become free game for very harsh criticism. Quick and effective world building is an absolute must when adapting any piece of fiction, and even more so in terms of developing characters that the audience actually likes. This is so important for Halo because otherwise it's just a bunch of mindless aliens trying to stomp out humanity. If it's not handled correctly, it comes across as generic science fiction, and as fans of Halo, we know that it's anything but. And funnily enough, the first live-action Halo adaptation, not counting Neil Blomkamp's Halo 3 shorts, got this right over a decade ago. So why not start with that?
Mayday, Mayday. Forward unto dawn. Immediate evac 117.
The canon of Halo is rich.
You can't imagine the wealth of information. The knowledge, so much, so fast. It's glorious.
And I could spend countless hours talking about all the subtle nuances that set it apart from other science fiction. Whether it's the sleek design of Covenant cruisers, the grotesque and uncanny art style of the Flood, or the UNSC's weapons and uniforms. Quick honourable mention to Jim Cameron's Aliens, the clear inspiration for the UNSC, right down to this magnificent man.
I'm good. Yeah. Chief,
Regardless of my individual bias and appreciation for Halo's aesthetics, there are arguably 5 key factions that need to be established if you're planning to build your own Halo timeline, assuming you want to remain faithful enough to be recognisable as Halo. The UNSC, the Insurrectionists, the Covenant, the Forerunners, and the Flood. Each faction has a distinct look, motivation, and rationale that make them immediately identifiable. This also helps to frame where the story is taking place at any given time. Think Game of Thrones in its prime. Each location had a distinct look, feel, and signature which rarely led to confusion, right down to the factions of each continent. Establishing these factions and the conflicts between them is also critical to building the stakes for the characters within the story. Otherwise, the audience does not have the context as to why the aliens are bad and why we should care about the humans fighting against them. When this is done well, we are introduced to characters who gradually feed us information about the world they inhabit. This is often achieved through a new character experiencing the world for the first time. Sometimes it's done through an opening crawl or an exposition dump by way of flashback with narration. Whichever way the writer/director chooses to deliver this information, it needs to be delivered promptly or at an appropriate time. Otherwise you risk confusion, or worse, apathy from your audience. When Halo Forward Unto Dawn released, there were mixed reactions. I'm not going to lie about that. Mostly because, like Reach, it took some liberties with the established timeline. Regardless of that fact, and being the first, albeit tentative step on 343's overcorrections with the franchise, Forward Unto Dawn should still be heralded as an excellent example of world building for both old and new fans. Being part of the Halo canon and thus enjoying all the relevant lore associated with the main timeline, the show still built the world to establish the stakes for the series. Until those stakes changed, of course, which served the narrative. Let's take a quick look.
We are at war with insurrectionists, terrorists, who would like nothing more than to see all of us dead. Had this been a real firefight, the rebels would have likely killed every member of Hastati's squad.
This is great world building, delivered with relevance to the story and in a timely manner that also helps establish key characters and their attitudes towards the world's status quo. It also allows for conflicts to grow naturally between characters based on their worldviews, which generates drama that is relevant to the story, rather than being shoehorned in there for drama's sake.
You got secrets.
Stop stepping on our dicks, Lasky.
Hey, ease up, gingerbread.
No, Sully, Vickers is right. My combat scores suck because of you.
Don't bother, JJ. He's gone soft. He's an any lover now.
Dima, that order didn't make any sense.
Doesn't have to make sense. Just follow it.
I'm trying to survive here, okay?
You need to respect a chain of command. The UNSC isn't the enemy. The innies are.
Spoken like a true believer.
Yeah, well, at least I believe in something these days.
At least I believe in something?
I do believe in something.
Yeah, so do I.
Like what?
Just not in stupid orders that lead to needless violence.
Negotiating isn't an option anymore, Tom.
So we're brainwashing kids and then sending them in to exterminate a bunch of overtaxed farmers.
Farmers. That's who you think they are. You have no idea what the innies are like.
I have a pretty good idea.
Dad, I tried. I sucked up my pride and I gave it my best.
I believe you.
Selling Dr. Halsey's Spartans to a rebel of all people, as if Halsey would ever do a thing to promote me.
That's not entirely
Please
fair.
don't defend her. She's done nothing but throw roadblocks in my way.
Halsey's always been single-minded. Work is the only thing that matters. I made my peace with that a long time ago. It's nothing personal.
Nothing personal isn't a great excuse when it's your mom.
Running in parallel to these discussions is the physical location of the story, the Corbulo Military Academy, which helps establish the UNSC's sense of identity. The location becomes an important story tool and character of its own, rather than just being there to look interesting.
So we're doing kind of a Wall-E kind of world. And so I wanted to do a Wall-E kind of shot. So I pitched it to them and then they were, oh great, so we wrote it in.
Are you mentally handicapped?
By the end of part 1 of Forward Unto Dawn, 26 minutes for those of you keeping score, the audience, even if they've had no exposure to Halo before, have a key understanding of the current state of the galaxy, the UNSC being at war with the Outer Colonies, and the key characters in the story and their feelings about that conflict. This is why when the status quo is directly challenged by the real antagonist of Halo, the Covenant, later in the show, the UNSC characters and audience all go on the same journey together. Do we need an information dump about who the Covenant are and what they want at this point? Well, probably not, because it's the beginning of what will become a decade-spanning war. The show also enjoys the privilege of being within the core timeline. Therefore, old fans already know who the Covenant are. But the stage is also set for new fans. Humans good, aliens bad, and very dangerous. The world building, establishment of key factions, and reveal of the Covenant are all succinct and well executed in Fought Unto Dawn.
Calamity! If only we had more time!
And a bigger budget. Also, it's worth mentioning that Fought Unto Dawn's total runtime is about 126 minutes. The entire project was also completed for under $10 million. With that in mind, let's take a look at the Silver timeline, with $10 million spent per episode, and each serial having an average length of 48 minutes for 9 episodes in total. Here, it is even more important that they establish the key players and develop their world, because the Halo series does not have the luxury of drawing from the same lore, as it's in a separate timeline to the main Halo story. Therefore, key events, characters and their motivations are not yet established. In a similar time span to Fought Unto Dawn, in the first episode we get introduced to the colonists of Madrigal, the Covenant and the UNSC. But do we really? How much information does the audience actually get on these key factions and their relationships with one another? I would argue that what we actually get in terms of world building in the first, second, and even third episodes of the Halo series is a couple of passing references to events or circumstances that will be well known to long-time Halo fans, but will leave new viewers confused without framing the current state of the galaxy. Example: one of the first pieces of information we get given by the colonists on Madrigal is that they have been fighting a war with the UNSC, presumably for a long time, but we never learn why. At best guess, it's over resources. We get told that the Spartans are mindless killing machines and are worth over 100 Marines. Okay, checks out in terms of the canon, I guess. And the colonists seem to hate them enough to shoot them on sight, even while being attacked by aliens. This info dump of show don't tell becomes a bit of a trend in the Halo series, but we'll get to that. Comparing this to one of the first pieces of information we get given in Fought Unto Dawn, depending on which version you watch, because one version opens with the cadets being interviewed and the other goes straight into the action. Regardless, we get the speech from General Black shortly after.
Every single one of you at this academy was sent here because your parents are the upper echelon of the United Nations Space Command. Because all of you are its future. And I expect you to act like it.
Understood, sir!
Well, what are you waiting for? Lead them on tour, Orensky.
While General Black's speech from Fought Unto Dawn probably leans a little bit too hard into the tell-don't-show aspect of storytelling, unlike the scene in the Halo series, it actually serves multiple purposes. It sets up conflict between Lasky and the rest of his squad mates. It defines the key conflict in the story at this point, as well as the stakeholders involved, and gives us a little bit of history into the characters and location where all this is taking place. It also has the added benefit of setting General Black up as the false antagonist, which adds stakes to the story when the dynamics of the narrative shift later in the piece. Here we have a great example of world building and balancing the act of show don't tell in favour of character development and exposition. Also, the exposition dumping here is probably more forgivable in Fought Unto Dawn, noting that comparative to the Halo series, it has a relatively short runtime, versus the exposition and poor world building that takes place in the opening of the Halo series.
Spartans aren't human. They're faster, stronger, smarter. They cannot be stopped. They just keep on killing, without mercy. So there's nothing left to kill.
This monologue offers no real frame of reference for the conflict between the colonists and UNSC, also while missing an opportunity for character development, because
5 minutes later.
It's also unnecessary because in the very next scene we get to see the Spartans in action. Their glorious, glorious B-grade action. My god, it's so cringe. How did this fool anybody when it came out? Also, the series has a runtime of 454 minutes. It's not like there won't be time later to explore this stuff. Anyway, you can see my point, right? After 26 minutes in Fought Unto Dawn, we have a clear understanding that the UNSC is at war with the insurrectionists and why. Multiple characters within the show have their own experiences and feelings about that conflict, which adds drama and allows for exploration of character motivations, and also allows the audience to understand where the conflict sits in terms of the story. After 26 minutes of the Halo show, the characters that have done the bulk of the talking are now dead, so there's no character development to be gleaned here, and they've dropped the first and last frame of reference for not only the UNSC's conflict with the colonists of Madrigal, but also for the current state of the Human Covenant War.
We've been fighting these alien creatures for years and we still have no idea what they want, where to find them or how to beat them.
I wish I was kidding about that last point, but I'm not. But the first episode doesn't equal an entire season, regardless of how important first impressions are, so let's compare the introduction and world building surrounding the Covenant and the Spartans, arguably two of the most important pieces of the Halo DNA. When the Spartans are introduced in Forward Unto Dawn, we see they are capable fighters, clearly outmatching the human insurrectionists. However, they are not able to deal with whatever the, at this point, unknown threat is. Not only does the introduction cause confusion for the main characters of the show,
Are they fighting together?
bringing their worldviews into doubt.
Guys, look, you're missing the point. What matters is that our soldiers were fighting alongside the insurrectionists. Why would we protect the enemy?
There is also a level of mystery around the Spartans and whatever it is that they're fighting. This way, when we encounter the Covenant later, through the eyes of the cadets, they are scary, and a real threat that haven't been undermined. The same can be said for the Spartans. While initially a curiosity that drives the plot forwards, they swiftly become a mystery that the audience wants answers to as well. Also, talk about respecting the main character of your franchise with his first live-action appearance.
We don't have much time. Let's go.
We, as the audience, are in awe, both of the Covenant threat and the Master Chief. To this day, this moment is still glorious, and highlights just how talented the writers and directors of Forward Unto Dawn were, crafting scenes that not only progressed the narrative, but also enhanced the world building and character development at the same time. Barely a minute of runtime is wasted by Forward Unto Dawn in this regard, compared to the Covenant's introduction in the Silver Timeline, where the Covenant pose a credible threat for 12 minutes before the Spartans turn up and make a mockery of them in their first encounter together. Also, this action set piece does barely anything to drive the narrative forward, apart from a subplot that actively goes nowhere, but we'll touch on that when we get to the story component. Forward Unto Dawn shows that despite how impressive the Spartans are, the Covenant still pose a threat to them too. This builds the stakes and sets the rules of what is to come. People can and will die in this conflict, and no one gets to play the game on easy. After just 126 minutes, at the end of Forward Unto Dawn, the table is set, the Covenant are introduced and pose a credible threat, and the Spartans are clearly shown as the best weapon to combat that threat, rather than us being told that that is the case.
John was enhanced and trained for one purpose: to fight for us. And at the moment, he and the other Spartans are our only effective weapons against the Covenant.
We know all human parties are aware of the Covenant's existence because we just saw them encounter them. And in those encounters, we saw the human cost of a conflict with the Covenant. Something that is shown to us in the visual medium of storytelling, and as a result, doesn't need to be blatantly stated.
Yours isn't the first planet to face the Covenant, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. If we don't all join together, I don't know how we're gonna stop them. I lost my whole family when I was just a little younger than you are now. Lost my whole planet to the Covenant. Everyone I love.
We also have several characters who have individual and complex motivations that would be interesting to follow as the Human Covenant War begins. And, to cap this all off, we see the Covenant glassing the planet, setting the scene of destruction for what is to come. In a similar length of time in the Silver Timeline, 58 minutes worth from episode 1, we've been told there is a war between the UNSC and the colonists of Madrigal, but we don't see it or have any context behind it. We get introduced to the Covenant, who initially prove dangerous and imposing as they slaughter the colonists of Madrigal, looking like hot CGI garbage as they do so, only to be met by the Spartans who make short work of them, thereby undercutting them as the primary threat of the show. We then get told, not shown, that the UNSC has been at war with the Covenant for years, implying that the galaxy is at war and that humanity could very much be in a fight for the survival of their race. And yet, the outer colony of Madrigal seemingly has no idea that the Covenant exist. Already, partway through episode 1, there is confusion about what the focus of the conflict even is within the Halo show. Do the Covenant want to exterminate humanity, or are they only interested in these random artifacts and the colonists just happen to be in the way? If so, why did every single elite drop what they were doing in a chance to go kill the entire colony, when evidently the artifact was something of great importance to the Covenant? How did the UNSC have such an effective PR team that the entire galaxy seems to know about the Master Chief, but they are not aware of the galaxy-wide threat of hostile aliens? What happened between the UNSC and Madrigal to the point where the colonists would stop shooting at aliens that have literally slaughtered women and children to actively shoot at Spartans instead? Oh, don't worry, that gets answered as one of the subplots that goes absolutely nowhere. It's okay to have questions lingering about world building at the end of the first episode of a new season, but unfortunately these questions don't get any answers as the show goes on. In fact, it arguably gets more confusing, because the cast of characters grows with each episode, and unfortunately there's no distinguishing factors about any of them. All of the costumes, sets and props look like they've come straight out of the 21st century. The only distinguishing factor is the Master Chief's armour, which throughout the majority of the season he decides not to wear. Any future world building is done by info dumping at random intervals throughout the show, which would normally be a bad thing, but when the characters and dialogue in the show are so bad that you're craving a little bit of exposition to get away from it, it's actually a welcome reprieve. The rare moments where there's a bit of world building that's actually organic to the narrative is so far and in between that it's difficult to remember that they even occurred. I think there's one scene in the entire show that I would say actively had good world building that developed the characters and story at the same time. And it's one scene from a show of 454 minutes. In a show titled Halo, based on Halo, which for the first decade of its existence revolved around the Human Covenant War, to have as much understanding of that Human Covenant War, which spanned the known galaxy, at the end of the season as you do at the start of the season, is unforgivable, and clearly demonstrates that either 1, the showrunners had no idea what they were doing, or 2, they didn't care. Either way,
Halo's destruction was your error, and you rightly bear the blame.
I could continue to rant about the lack of world building in the Halo series, but I've already put more effort into it than Paramount did, so let's switch targets to the narrative, because surely there's a little bit of meat on the bone there.
This place will become your tomb.
There are 3 main story threads in Season 1 of the Silver Timeline. Chief discovering his humanity via the mysterious artifact featuring Makee, the human living with the Covenant. Quan Ha's rebellion against the governor of Madrigal featuring ex-Spartan Soren. And finally, Halsey's scientific endeavours featuring Jacob and Miranda Keyes alongside Admiral Parangoski. Notice something?
Rather, you notice something that is not there to be noticed.
Correct, there is a distinct lack of the Covenant in the main story threads of Season 1, and it would be very generous to say that they even have a B-plot, as 90% of the Covenant screen time that they do get is focused on Makee, whose purpose in the story is to serve as a MacGuffin before being railed by John and then killed. Poor form, Paramount, poor form. The Covenant very much feel like an afterthought, or at times even an annoyance to the showrunners, whom would rather explore the morality of the UNSC and Dr. Halsey, a rebellion on Madrigal, and the adventures of current-day weapon-wielding space pirates who dress like they've just come down with a bad case of Saturday Night Fever. While there is nothing inherently wrong with telling new stories within the Halo universe, when you fail to set up the framework that makes Halo Halo, the show comes off looking like a generic science fiction melodrama rather than a faithful adaptation. The biggest problems with the story is that there is a complete lack of any Halo-level stakes that fans have come to expect from their franchise. An absence of clear story direction, compounded by character bloat and unnecessary side plots, and a lack of a clear foundation comprised of Halo's core elements to frame the drama that the show does focus on. At its core, Halo is a story about humanity's fight to exist in the galaxy, and depending on where you start that adventure, it could mean pre-humans versus the Flood, pre-humans versus the Forerunners, humans against humans, humans against the Covenant, humans against the Flood again, and humans against the Forerunners again, and so on. Regardless of the war being waged at whichever point in human history, the stakes and scale of the conflict are always made very clear, normally the threat of extinction. Hence this absolute banger. These impossibly high stakes generate a sense of urgency and risk to every action that takes place, where even something as small as making a promise to a friend can have dire repercussions against the backdrop of a galaxy at war. This means there are real consequences for the characters of the story, and if they're well written, like they are in the Halo games, you start to worry if everyone's going to make it through. The Silver Timeline lacks those stakes, or if I'm being super generous, did a very poor job of outlining them in the show. This is technically a world building problem rather than a story one, but unfortunately for the writers of the Halo show, you can't really have one without the other. Halo's story is firmly rooted in the Human Covenant War, there's no getting around it. And why would you want to get around it? It's fascinating and would look great in a television show. When you remove or fail to define the stakes of a story, you neuter any urgency the audience should be feeling in any given situation, because there's no consequences.
There's no way you can save the artifacts and the team.
Tell him to make it count.
Ask a casual fan what they'd expect to see in a Halo show, and once they're over the conniption of the idea of Master Chief removing his helmet, they will tell you that they're expecting to see a story about Master Chief fighting overwhelming odds to save humanity. That probably looks something like waves of Ungor and Kig'Yar being commanded by calculated Sangheili leaders, ghosts, wraiths, and massive armies colliding in both ground and space battles. In short, even the most casual of fans knows what they expect to see when they sit down to watch Halo. Underpinning all that, even without delving into the additional lore and only using the first 4 games, are the characters and the interpersonal stories that make us care. The relationships between Chief, Cortana and Keyes, Miranda and Johnson, Sergeant Stacker, Gunnery Sergeant Buck, and Chip's how bloody good Dubbo.
Is that me? Hey mate, I don't think they're going to give you a medal for that one.
We care about these characters not only because they're well written, but because there are stakes to the story, and we've seen the consequences on both sides of the war. The backdrop of war is a fantastic place for dramatic storytelling, but it needs to be clearly framed. With the risk of death looming as a consequence of war, each interaction between characters feels significant. Without it, the Silver Timeline's characters and stories are as hollow as Cortana's blue box. In the opinion of this jellyfish, this is the biggest problem with Season 1 of the Silver Timeline. There are no stakes or consequences in the story, and definitely not on the scale that Halo fans have come to expect and quite frankly deserve. The writers of the show were so hyper-focused on telling new stories that they completely missed laying the foundation of Halo first. Sure, at the end of episode 1 we're introduced to the Covenant, Colonists and UNSC, all who play a part in the story, but for the next 4 episodes the show is so focused on low-stakes B-plots and drama, rather than the Covenant itself. Despite learning at the end of episode 2 that if the Covenant get their hands on this mysterious artifact, that's it, game over. The interpersonal dramas between Halsey and John, Quan and Miranda, Miranda and Jacob, Jacob and Halsey, Halsey and Parangoski, Halsey and Miranda detract from the urgency of the emerging Covenant threat. A threat that should be in its apex in the year 2552. And without that threat, all these interpersonal conflicts don't matter because the audience hasn't been given any context for it. Worse, all this infighting paints the UNSC as a collective of backstabbing idiots who would rather abuse their authority rather than combat the Covenant. Subplot competes with subplot, until the core narrative is so confused that John ends up ignoring a chance to kill the Covenant hierarchy and end the war.
Don't mind us, we'll just sit here.
There is literally an entire subplot of Quan going rogue after escaping Madrigal, or where the Covenant killed her father, only to return to a planet and fight a corrupt governor, because honor or something, despite the Covenant knowing where that planet is, and doesn't have a UNSC defending it. This is something that would never happen in the core timeline. Because in Halo, if the Covenant finds a human world, they do one of 2 things. 1, they covertly locate and recover Forerunner artifacts, logging the planet for destruction later, or 2, they glass the planet in place and kill humans upon it. The end state is the same, the only variable is when they glass the planet. As it stands, we don't see a Covenant glassing in the show until the second last episode, and again, there's no context around it. And then the entire headquarters stares at it like it's the first time they've seen it. Why these writers would choose to see these subplots as more important than the core narrative, knowing that no matter who wins these petty squabbles, humanity still loses to the Covenant, is beyond me. But I think that's the point. The show fundamentally missed the core aspects of Halo, so despite its aesthetics, it comes across as B-grade sci-fi that looks vaguely of Halo.
I love this fully fleshed out world that I get to feel like I have a place in and understand and am part of. which is why I love the idea of also sort of pivoting that a little bit and telling a different kind of story.
Telling your audience something is important is not the same as showing them, and there's no greater example of this than John. I'll cover Chief in greater detail shortly, but the decision to focus on him discovering his humanity in Season 1 means very little when the show hasn't defined who he is before he changes. There is a massive juxtaposition in the show between who the Silver Timeline tells us John is versus what the audience is actually shown versus who he is in the core timeline. And for the most part, it comes across as lazy and unfocused writing. It's a 1-2 punch of alienating old fans and not achieving investment from new fans. Relying on canon knowledge that isn't relevant to the new story you're trying to tell simply doesn't work if you don't lay the groundwork first. But I've banged on about that for long enough. Let's talk about the biggest point of contention that most fans have unanimously agreed on.
You will become the best we can make you.
Master Chief John 117 is a pop culture legend and one of the most widely recognised characters in modern gaming, and the task of bringing him to live action was not a small one. Forward Unto Dawn did a great job of this, at least in the opinion of this jellyfish. The Halo show, not so much. It would be very easy and certainly tempting to target my annoyance directly at Pablo Schreiber.
And so, you know, this version of the Chief is my version of the Chief. It contains a huge respect for what Steve Downes achieved as creating the performance of the Chief.
I know how the game is played, Cortana.
But at the end of the day, he didn't write, produce or direct the show, and his performance is only as good as the sources behind it.
And, you know, my job as an actor is to bring to life the vision of the showrunner. And on Season 1, the showrunner was Stephen Kane, and it was my job to bring to life his vision for the show.
That said, I have taken issue with a few things Pablo said in the lead up to the show's premiere, but I will acknowledge that he is at least partially correct with this statement.
Yeah, it's iconic. It's an iconic character, and, you know, a huge part of that comes from the fact that when you play the video game, you play as him, so there's a part ownership that everybody has over the Chief because, you know, you use him to play the game.
True enough, but the character is so much more than an empty vessel that the player inhabits. This, like the show's world building, is a massive oversimplification. Yes, there were, and still are, plenty of casual fans who got very mad when Chief took his helmet off, and kept taking it off, again, and again, and again. Sometimes in an active war zone. But the real issue here is that John from the core timeline was already a very human and fleshed out character.
Then researching the actual mythology, like starting to read about the timelines of all of this stuff and where it went. There's 17 novels. I obviously didn't read all 17 of them yet.
And he did not act like this. I assume the reason Pablo took such a hard line against the helmet, based on his comments outside the show, is because in his mind, Chief is more than his armor. There is a human beneath it.
The reality is, as storytellers and as artists, we have to follow our own instincts, you know, so I had to make my own choices about what was going to be interesting about the role and what was going to be interesting about the character and what was going to be interesting about the series, and then go forward, you know, as strongly and as committed as I could to make the story that I believe was going to be the most compelling and the most interesting. You know, the video game is a first-person shooter video game, and they treat the character in one way because of the nature of the medium. Television show is a very, very different medium, and what works for video games is very different than what works for TV and what's going to pay off for a long-form television series and for the character within that. I mean, you read into a guy who's behind the mask. We put a lot of our feelings onto him. He's this heroic stand-in for all of our feelings of heroism and bravery. But now we start to take the armor off, take the mask off, and we start to get to know him a little bit as a human. The dialogue that begins to happen is the dialogue between the symbol and the human. And those are the themes that we'll start to unpack as the series goes on.
And again, this is very true, but the show's obsession with being the first one to explore the human underneath got in the way of who John actually was when he was wearing the armor. Chief is a soldier first and foremost. He's task-orientated, professional and dedicated. But he is also capable of great compassion, empathy, anger and sadness. He was never a one-dimensional doomslayer. But for some reason, this was the attitude of the actor playing the character and the showrunners. Their total lack of understanding of Chief's character actually baffles me.
When you first read the project and you first dive into that, I mean, the biggest sort of thing is the absolutely sort of epic scale again of the Spartans. They are these enormous, monstrous kind of, killing machines. Their weapons, their tanks, they're incredibly impressive beasts. Strength and invincibility of Master Chief and how he became the thing that he is, and whether he likes that, wants that, or whether he's going to change course, and all these very, very, very sort of subtle character dances that he makes, whilst at the same time always being Master Chief.
It's one thing to want to tell your own story with an established character, but reinventing the wheel and totally missing the mark in the process is truly something else.
But we've looked at it from a little bit of a different perspective. So there's a lot that will be very, very familiar for people who know that story already. There's things that will feel new and things that will feel a little bit different.
It's all the little things that bring the Silver Timeline's chief unstuck. The childlike emotions and temper tantrums in place of his professionalism, the arrogance in place of confidence, the lack of soldier-like discipline in favour of selfish egocentrism instead of a stoic willingness to put the mission first. He is very much the victim of modern writers who don't understand how a soldier thinks, feels or acts, let alone a soldier as professional as John 117. As for his interactions with other characters, there is this out-of-place reverence and respect for him, which would only be natural in the core timeline, but in the Silver Timeline, the show hasn't given any justification for it. We are told constantly that John is the best soldier in the UNSC, but then the show shows us scenes of him going AWOL, disobeying direct orders, having violent mood swings, and being actively insubordinate to senior ranking members of the UNSC. And unlike in Halo 4, where Chief disobeys a direct order for the greater good of humanity, John's insubordination in the Silver Timeline leads to nothing but more problems. As bad as making poor tactical decisions that actively put humanity in harm's way. This is not how you write a professional soldier. This is Chief being played by a 13-year-old with ADHD who cannot regulate their emotions. And yet everyone, including the Admiral of Fleetcom, just accepts his behaviour because he's the Master Chief.
Is that wise? Master Chief is not only a valuable battle asset, he's a symbol for the whole war effort.
So this writing, coupled with the performance of an actor hyper-focused on showing the human with emotions underneath, gives us this uncanny dude stomping around like he's the Master Chief from the core timeline, without having earned any of it. Chief's portrayal in Season 1 is very much superficial, a shallow performance by an actor who didn't understand the nuance of the character, written by people with no understanding of Halo's lore or basic military activities. But why does any of this matter? So what if Season 1 of the Silver Timeline was a total mess? It's not part of the core timeline and you don't have to watch it. It matters to me because I'm a fan. I care because despite Paramount's best efforts to the contrary, it's Halo. It's something that I love, and to see it misrepresented is painful. There was a time when Microsoft guarded Halo so closely that they refused to make a film in case they got it wrong. There was genuine reverence for the franchise and its characters. But since 343's been in charge, the franchise has stumbled from bad decision to poorer execution, without a clear and single creative vision to guide those working on the projects. The first 3 Halo games, hell even ODST and Reach, are all bound by the same vision that was Halo, and it shows. They're consistent and they feel like part of the same story. 4, 5 and Infinite, my complex feelings on those games being put aside for the moment, are so vastly different from each other in art style, storytelling and gameplay, it's hard to believe they came from the same studio, let alone the same franchise. This is why Halo Season 1 feels so wrong. There is nothing that makes it feel like Halo. It's all skin-deep gloss, and when exposed to the cold light of day, reeks of a lack of depth and understanding. Generic science fiction for the streaming generation rather than a worthy adaptation of a much-loved franchise that some fans had been waiting 20 years for. Another victim of 343's lack of creative direction and vision. The literal corporate execution of creativity.
Chief, I'm so sorry.
So, is there hope for Season 2?
Oh my god, who the hell cares?
Well, based on the trailers, there's been a massive creative shift on the show. Fancy that. with the new showrunner actually attempting to focus on the elements that make Halo Halo. But it doesn't matter if they get it right now. You don't get a second chance at a first impression, and the impression left by Season 1 is one of total lack of care for my favourite sci-fi franchise. Don't worry, I'll review it, but truth be told, I'll probably get mad if they get it right now, after fundamentally mishandling Season 1. Is anyone else over the fact that they can't get excited for anything anymore because you know the studio system's going to absolutely fumble it? Oh well, we'll always have Deliver Hope, We Are ODST, and Landfall. But remember, I'm just a brainless lump, who's really hoping my harbour's fortifications are ready for the imminent assault of Halo Season 2.
Whoa! This is the moment we feared, people. Many of you thought it would never happen, but I insisted we spend 2 hours every morning training for it. You all thought I was mad. Many of you requested to be transferred to another peanut factory. But now,
Uru, mate.